My ex-stepdaughter and her baby lived with me and my husband for a period. I woke up one night and heard thumping noises coming from the baby's room. He was only 9 months old at the time, so I went to check on him, and there was a black smoke in his room. It had this horrible smell like sulfur. As soon as I saw it, it disappeared. When questioned, the mom said she didn't know what happened. All she remembered was putting her son to bed, then waking up to me screaming for her. We eventually moved out. We felt very uncomfortable with whatever this thing or spirit was hanging around her. We eventually got her a really nice apartment in a nice neighborhood, surrounded by strangers. She had been there for about 3 months when she woke up one night and heard the angriest, and I mean angriest voice screaming at her from outside the window. She would not go back to the house after that. I wouldn't blame her. Shortly after this and before the smoke situation, she kept complaining of seeing this large coyote running around outside by the house, that it always seemed to be following her. It was like a bad omen, always bringing bad luck, scaring her. She never said anything about it shapeshifting or walking on 2 legs, which I guess is a good thing. But either way, I think a skinwalker had marked her, and that's what she was dealing with. I know when she was younger, she had ripped off quite a few people. She kind of went through a whole drug stint for a while, and made some really poor choices. I almost wonder if she ripped off the wrong person, and that person just so happened to be a skinwalker. I'm pretty sure it was a skinwalker, or something close to it. My in-laws live in Skagway, Alaska, and they had bought a cabin in a little town called Haines Junction. They got it for dirt cheap. Nobody else wanted anything to do with it. They said the place had been haunted, weird sightings of strange things going on. My in-laws heard the same rumors and decided to go for it anyway, despite getting warnings from everybody about it being a bad idea. They were just looking for a nice quiet place for their retirement years. This is what my husband told me all that happened there. The very first night they arrived, they were cooking dinner, and she heard voices outside, people talking. She said it sounded like distinctive native chatter, like it was in a language she did not recognize, but sounded tribal or native. She went to open the door, but nobody was there. No sign of anybody. When she walked back into the kitchen, her food had been moved from where she left it to a completely different spot on the other side of the stove, even though nobody else was outside, let alone her in her house. Another time, my mother-in-law woke up early to go fishing before anybody else got up. She took her bucket out of the garage, set it next to the house. When she came back inside, she saw that somebody had moved her bucket from where she'd left it beside the door. Not a big deal, right? Well, when she walked across the driveway toward where her bucket should have been, there were sets of footprints going in both directions across a perfectly plowed section of snow that had not been touched since they got there the day before. My mother-in-law is a tough old broad, but I could see how this would really startle anybody. The worst thing happened was around 1 a.m. one night. My father-in-law had waken up. He thought he heard this dog growling, so he went downstairs. Well, he didn't find his dog, but he did find 2 sets of footprints that looked like it should be human-sized feet leading into the woods behind the house. I asked him if there had been snow covering up any tracks at the time, because it tends to get weird up in those parts. Turns out it had snowed, but there would have been no way for anything to be covered up. Now, my mother was born and raised about 40 minutes north of Gallup, New Mexico, where reservations are abundant, and children, unfortunately, go missing often. When she was only 14, herself, she went with a group of friends to see if they could see some kind of UFO, or maybe even meet an alien. Supposedly, it was sighted nearby. She says they got to the top of the hill where there was an overgrowth of shrubbery and trees. It looked like 2 people could have easily fit there and laid flat together. The shrubbery was very thick. Nothing living or green grew there, and it was not full of thorns. Anyway, she then recounts how after 30 minutes, at most, they hear something walking up behind them, smelling like rotting flesh, but not making any sounds. She said her friends started freaking out, telling her to run, but she could not move her feet. She was rooted to the spot, as if somebody had put a spell on her body. When everything fell silent for 10 seconds, one of her friends whom she was with screamed. My mother looked back and said something or somebody had grabbed her friend's neck with one hand, raised her a good foot off the ground, and she had never been seen or heard from since. Since then, my mother has tried to connect with spirits through seances, etc. Nothing ever works out for her. She is very spiritual and believes in an afterlife, but doesn't think people should tamper with the spirit world, although she is desperate to try and connect with long-lost loved ones. As far as I'm concerned, she is still stalked by the same Skinwalker. I've been a long-time believer in everything paranormal. I live in Washington State, and for about a year now, I've been seeing shadow figures when driving at night. They follow me at times I'm driving, or walking around areas. Then recently, over the past 3 months, my best friend that lives with us has been acting very strange. We have a washer and dryer in our garage. She will be sleeping on top of it while we are sleeping and watching TV. When I ask her why she is always looking over her shoulder, saying something is going to get her or somebody else in the family, or if somebody comes near you, stay away from them. They don't like anybody in the family. Stuff like that. She claims that somebody, a dark man in dark robes, are out to get her. We're all kind of very confused and perplexed by this statement. Not sure what she means. But apparently, she's been getting very, very drunk and seeing these strange figures off in the garage. One night, apparently a big coyote tried to break into the garage and scare her. I don't know. She said it walked like a man and had red eyes. Told her it was going to possess her and get her. I wasn't at the house that night, but she was so scared she urinated in her pants. Sometimes she goes out for walks and smokes cigarettes. But one night, she was so scared because she claimed she was followed by the man in dark robes that she ran back to the house. She's tried everything from salt lines to burning sage in every room in the house, but nothing really seems to be working. So at nighttime, she keeps a fluorescent light on. Apparently that's supposed to keep spirits away. I don't know. That's just what she told me. Is she crazy, or what's going on? She tells me she has to be careful, or the spirit man, which she calls, will come. She claims that he is a Skinwalker spirit, or an evil entity, that can shapeshift and take possession of her and anybody it wants. I'm really looking for help. I would really love to see if we can get her some mental help. Maybe she's possessed. Maybe she's cracked out. I don't know. Either way, I greatly think she could benefit from seeing a therapist. Maybe she is really experiencing something real. It's hard to say. Any help or advice would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. In the 1990s, when I was a kid, my grandmother told me about a story that she had when she was about 16 in the early 1960s. It is a pretty scary Skinwalker encounter story that scared the heck out of me back then, and still does to this day. She lived on the Navajo reservation in a little town called Fort Defiance. She lived with 10 brothers and sisters. Most were teenagers at this time, but also married with their own kids. My grandpa later joined them there from Arizona after they got married to go live together back on the reservation where he grew up working on the farm, which was also considered part of the Navajo Res. There wasn't much trespassing going on. There weren't any specific houses directly next to theirs, but one side had another family close by, and the other side was empty land for a while, until another family moved there after my grandmother graduated high school. One night, during this time, their dog began barking out of nowhere, like it normally did when somebody came to their house, or if one of the kids did something they weren't supposed to do. However, that night was different. Their dogs barked and went crazy so loud, the whole neighborhood could hear it, which she said was very unusual. They usually only go crazy at people who come up close to their property line, which wouldn't be too far, since Navajo land is massive. My grandfather woke up immediately, went outside with his gun, prepared in case somebody was trying to trespass onto their land. He had lost cattle before from thieves on the res. They never caught anyone when they looked for them. Yet my grandmother and her sisters always saw hoofprints in the morning, mysteriously disappearing into thin air. Nobody ever believed them. No cattle ever found to prove it either. This happened a couple of times before my grandma moved onto their property. One night, after everybody went to bed, including their dogs, everybody woke up from a very loud gunshot sound just outside, early in the morning. They all ran outside to see what was going on, to see if somebody was trying to come onto their property again. My grandfather said he remembered looking at his gun afterwards, before he shot it earlier that day. The dogs were going crazy. They were so loud that even during the gunshots, which probably scared off whatever it was. But by this time, they all saw the creature that was standing by the barn as it ran off in the darkness. One of my grandma's sisters yelled out, "Oh my goodness, it's a skinwalker." She said her grandmother and other uncles and aunts always talked about skinwalkers, but never really believed them, until now. One day, we will be lucky. They used to say that because we would see how powerful and smart they were if we knew who or what we were dealing with. Grandma said the skinwalker looked weirdly calm before it ran off after hearing his sister yell that name out, which always confused me. Like most creatures, I think it would have either attacked or took off running before anyone got their chance to shoot at it. But like in most horror movies, it got its way. She said it looked like it disappeared into thin air after getting shot at by my grandpa and the rest of the family. It disappeared, not making any sound as if whatever it was. Guns just simply did not affect it. They did not see any blood, meaning they believed this was supernatural. She claims everybody began to panic. What they saw was so freaky. They decided to go back inside for safety. This happened less than a year before her dad passed away from cancer. I wonder if she thought this skinwalker came for him because he got sick soon after, like some sort of premonition. Or maybe one of them knew about the skinwalker, or maybe they thought that the skinwalker had something to do with it. She was too scared to go back outside until they found out their dog had been shot in the neck and miraculously survived. She said that when she told her grandma about this, her grandmother seemed very relieved that something finally happened, which made all of them realize that skinwalkers were real. Towards the end of her story, she said, one day, their other dog began going crazy again, right around 11:25 p.m. This time, it did not seem to be barking at anything specific, or nothing seemed to be happening, but her sister kept yelling, "Get inside! Get inside!" There was no way another skinwalker was waiting for them. Her sister said that during the day, she saw a figure standing nearby, watching them before disappearing into thin air, before anybody else could shoot it. Everybody ran inside and started to lock all the doors and windows, including their garden gate. Even though they had no idea why they were doing this, they knew skinwalkers could walk through any kind of material, but maybe there was a chance. They stayed up all night with their guns and dogs, looking outside, looking for anything suspicious before going to bed. The very next day, after this encounter, the grandmother saw hoofprints in the sand, meaning this skinwalker wasn't trying to be nice or come onto their property, because those prints were right at the edge of the fence line. She told her grandma about what happened last night, which made grandma realize this was the exact same thing as before. This thing had trespassed onto their property the same way. They were left with no choice but to move the entire farm. Her grandma and the entire family moved much closer to the city, where they lived for a little while, and the entire family helped pack everything up. They could not risk dealing with this sort of supernatural entity. After a while, it was certainly an adjustment, but everybody became happy again, and they could finally relax without worrying about any sort of entity coming onto their property during the day or night. Plus, it seemed like every single problem went away once they moved, which made them even happier. Even though they were pretty sure skinwalkers existed in some form or another, it didn't stop them from wondering if all the problems stopped occurring when they moved. which made them think everything they saw was just in their minds the whole time. They didn't know for sure what happened or why their farm suddenly went back to normal, but they assumed it was because something scared away whatever skinwalkers had been there. She really hopes that people start believing that they're not just a figment of her imagination. She said all this really did happen, even if people don't agree with the story. She still wants people to know in general it's true, and these things will hurt you, and it probably came for the grandpa because he was sick. First, a little bit of information on me. I'm a male. I have a lot of Native American in me. I'm kind of, I guess you would call a Native American mutt. Part Seminole, Choctaw, Apache, Navajo, Yakima, and Sioux. But I've primarily grown up and around the Navajo reservation, since that's where my current family lives and resides. I'm coming to you today with my own story dealing with these creatures. I have to be careful not to call them by their actual name. The last thing I want to do is bring any attention to myself, which is why I have to be careful. If I even just mention their name, I'm putting myself at risk. I hope you can understand, which I'm sure you do. My culture takes this very seriously. At least, most of us do. I was spending time seeing my dad, who lives on the far end side of the reservation. He doesn't really have much, but lives down in a broken old trailer. So my sister went to go visit him. My sister and I should say. It was about evening time when we got there, and he was drunk already, as usual. Unfortunately, my father and my mother separated when my sister and I were very young. He had a pretty severe alcohol problem, and it hasn't gotten much better. But that's besides the point. So we go to visit him, and all is well for the time being. We enjoy chit-chat and have a good time. I think I had brought over some sandwiches, and my sister and I keep him company. Well, now comes the nighttime, and we go sit out on the porch. My dad is also a pretty big smoker, but he likes to do things the old-fashioned way. I'm talking pipe tobacco, and he'll sit there for hours and just get lost in good conversation, puffing on his pipe tobacco while looking out in the endless darkness of the desert night. That's what this was. We were sitting around on this little makeshift porch that he'd had around his little camper. Him, my sister, and I are sitting on the porch just talking, looking off in the distance, when my father immediately begins growing very tense. I couldn't understand why at first. I could tell he was staring off at something in the night darkness, and just in that moment, as my sister and I were looking back at each other making faces, we could see that the figure he was staring at was coming close by. The level of panic that comes over my father's face was astounding at the speed in which it happened. He immediately tells us, quietly and seriously, "Get inside right now," and starts ushering a prayer under his breath. My sister and I don't ask questions. We go in the trailer immediately and lock the door, as instructed by our father. We could hear him start to pray very loudly, and his prayers got louder and louder until he began screaming. My sister and I were not sure what we should do. We open the door, and we see him being dragged away by this thing. It was this dark shadow, but from what we can tell, it was a man covered in pelts, and he is screaming, yelling prayers out like a maniac. I run inside, grab his .22, and aim it right at this thing and start shooting. The thing immediately lets go and runs off into the night, and my father is now completely paralyzed and hysterical in fear. We get him into the trailer and get him calmed down. We wanted to ask him what it was, but deep down, we knew exactly what it was. We asked him after he had calmed down why it came for him. He said he's been having problems lately. I guess about 8 months ago, he made a deal with the man and completely ripped him off and never paid him back. Ever since then, he's been having almost nightly visits from the same person, who he believes is a skinwalker. But he won't rat him out. He won't say who. Either way, it's entirely creepy. My sister and I did not stay the night, and we don't go over there as much now. If we do, it's definitely during the daytime, so we could avoid any possible confrontation with a skinwalker. I even hate saying that name. This was back in about 2005, 2006. I grew up on the Navajo reservation. At the time, I was about 13, maybe 14. I can't exactly remember. Me and my friend, who we'll call Rick, were bored a lot of the time. We would have to spend time exploring or hiking or just finding stuff to do. Which was fine, I guess. We always felt that nature was our escape, our getaway. So we tried to spend a lot more time outside just finding things to do, ways to stay entertained. So one day, when we were pretty bored, we decided to go out exploring. Now, from where our trailer was, there was this really large rock off in the distance, and we would always bet how far we could walk past it. Well, today was no different. We wanted to try and walk a mile past it, just for the sake of exploration and to cure boredom. So we make our way out to it and start walking around. Now, I should say that in this area, we do have to be careful. There are coyotes out here. You can hear them at night. Close by, there's also a lot of livestock, which again is a reason to be careful of the coyotes. Now, my friend made this discovery that's quite scary, and he's the one who actually pointed it out to me. And he said, "Hey, come over here, check this out." Maybe about 60 yards away from a pig pen, you can see what looked to be very large coyote tracks. But here's where it got creepy. You could follow the tracks all the way up to the pig pen, where you could see very slowly it looked like it went from 4-foot tracks to 2, and the tracks would slowly turn from a paw print to feet print, as if whatever it was slowly morphed from coyote to man. We got what many people call the heebie-jeebies and ran away. We spent the rest of the day in the trailer. Even though my mom was saying we should go out and play and spend the rest of the afternoon outside, we refused. We never told her why or what we saw or even what we found. We knew. We used to have an old cemetery right behind our house. Now, the one thing that sets this cemetery apart from other cemeteries is that this used to be a native burial ground, and not one that had a violent history or past, just simply a cemetery that several natives were buried at. It's actually half Europeans, half natives, surprisingly, and I think it's many natives who actually integrated into the Europeans way back when. But apparently, there's a lot of magic and mysterious energy around the cemetery. My grandmother always comes back here and prays in her native tongue. She always claims there's dark spirits and energies back here, and that it even takes form and attracts other things. I guess these energies take on the form of physical manifestations, such as shapeshifters, for example. She has many stories, since she has lived here for a very long time. I've only recently started moving in with her, over the past few years, since home life is no longer an option to live safely in. She always tells me to not come out here once the sun sets in the evening, that it's not safe, that I should stay inside and only come out during the daylight. I always ask her why. She says the man shows up. And while she's never hinted at exactly the word Skinwalker, based on her description of the physical manifestation of what she's seeing accurately depicts what it is. She encounters something that's far beyond anything we can comprehend. We're talking about some sort of physical, shape-shifting entity. And as she has told me, she has had many personal run-ons with it. Anyway, just thought you would find this interesting. I'll try and share more stories with you if I can. My name's Corey, by the way. You'll be hearing from me again. This was back in 2013. It was late summer, early fall, and I was busy in the wild, scouting for a perfect spot to go fishing. I'd come here many times before to fish, but I was looking for more than just river trout. Possibly some smallmouth bass or anything else a little more exotic I could get my hands on. However, I wouldn't refer to salmon or smallmouth bass at all as any way exotic, but, trout can get boring sometimes. So I found this creek, or a small river, and I began to scout out specific spots around to see if it would make for a good fishing area. There seemed to be a lot of activity, a very thick brush, a lot of wildlife. This also appeared to be by tracks, a high traffic area from game to come to drink. That's also a very good sign. So I set my pack down and began pulling out my sack of lures, setting my rod down. As I'm doing this, fumbling with my lures, I just get this instinctual feeling like someone's looking at me. I react and quickly look up, and when I do, looking at me from across the creek bed, maybe 35 to 40 feet away, was this face I can't even begin to describe. It was human-ish, and I say that because the rest of it was, I don't know. It kind of reminded me of a Halloween mask at first. You know, like those really cheap, cheesy Halloween werewolf masks. It was mostly humanoid looking, but it had strange eyes and very strange bone structure in its face. I wasn't scared as much as I was confused and trying to process what I saw. But it looked at me, and as soon as it realized I saw it quickly ducked behind the tree. And as soon as this happened, I got a really bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, like I needed to leave now. It's like every fiber in my being was screaming danger, danger. I very quickly picked my bag back up, put everything back in my pack, closed up my lures, and I said peace and got out of there. Fortunately, I didn't think I was followed by the thing, but I also didn't want to check behind my back and see. That was more than enough for me to ever want to endure. I was 17 when this happened. I was called over to my aunt and uncles who live in the countryside. They have a lot of cattle, a lot of horses, pigs, and chickens. I was called to watch them, which I was paid for. My aunt and uncle wanted to go out on a date night. I happily agreed. All I had to do was basically just house sit for the evening. They would not be getting back till either really late in the early morning or the following morning, which was fine by me. It was roughly about 5 p.m. I had already eaten dinner, and so I had access to the fridge and access to the house. My plan was to watch TV pretty much all night till about 10 or 11 p.m., where I would promptly crash out. No problem. I was promptly instructed that right before I go to bed, I needed to go out and make sure everything was closed up, the horses were taken care of, so were the pigs and the chickens. I thought no problem. I can do all that. Well, come to find out, they leave and everything's fine. But the evening would not be fine. I'll get to that in just a moment. So I turn on the TV, and they have some of the best satellite TV there is. I make some popcorn, and next thing you know, 3-4 hours flies by. It's now about 9:40 p.m. I'm getting a little tired, thinking I'll push myself just a little bit longer until I could stay awake. It gets to about 10:15, and at this point, I'm pretty wiped. I'm ready for some shut-eye. And then I realize, oh crap, I gotta go check on the horses real quick. So I get up, grab the keys and the flashlight. I gotta check on the horses and make sure everything's fine with them. They're all where they need to be in their stalls. Pigs are okay, and the chickens are okay. So after about 20 minutes later, I come back in the house. And now at this point, it's roughly about 10:35-ish. I'm wiped. I go to brush my teeth, and I lay down on the couch, falling asleep to some TV. One of my favorite pastimes. I'm starting to nod off. And it's like in that moment where you're half asleep but half awake, I hear this scream that kind of jets me awake. It wasn't a scream. It was the horses neighing. Something had startled them. I jump up off the couch, grab the flashlight and the keys, open the door, and I walk my way out there. As I get out there, they seem incredibly startled. They're all freaked out by something. I figured I'm not sure what it was, but maybe something spooked them. I don't know. Just then, I hear the pigs screaming, going crazy. So I run over to where the pigs are, and I stop. In the pig pen, holding onto one of the pigs, is this large coyote-looking creature. The first thing I saw was my light shining on its face. It was ugly. And it just looked up at me with this grueling, nasty expression on its face, as in put the light down now, or I'll get you too. I was terrified, and nearly dropping the flashlight. It picked up the pig that was screaming, reached over without breaking eye contact with me, and slit its throat right there. The pig, coughing and gurgling, and blood pouring out of its throat, as this creature effortlessly hung this thing upside down by its back legs while never breaking eye contact with me. It threw the body outside the pen like it was nothing, as if the pig weighed no more than 20 pounds, leapt outside the pen, like literally jumped out, and I could hear it pick up the pig, and it disappeared. I was frozen there for a moment, but quickly regained, and ran back to the house as fast as I could. I lock every door, I lock every window. I'm now fumbling with my phone to get in contact with my aunt. She doesn't pick up. I call her again. She doesn't pick up. It goes right to her voicemail. They're probably busy. I leave her voicemail saying, "You need to contact me now." There's some large thing back there that just killed a pig. So now I'm pacing around the house, and I'm pacing around the house, expecting something to happen. I don't even know what to even process or how to even comprehend what I just saw. What was that thing? I believe the Navajo have more to fear than we believe. I believe that skinwalkers really do exist out there in the desert night, awaiting their next victims. They are, after all, evil beings who enjoy the pleasure of preying on innocents. I think I had a sighting of one of these beings myself. I'd never really been a believer as a young child, until the point where I first saw one. I never had the courage or enough self-awareness to ever consider it truly possible. I'll tell you about the first one. Years ago, when I was a child, my father would tell me stories of his days in the military. He'd been an NP and would retell me with stories of war. Unfortunately, he was never able to tell me all of it. He would always leave out key details and stop talking when he would get to the good parts, such as the ones about skinwalkers. I believe he was probably threatened by the dark forces he had witnessed to never tell anybody of these things, even if they existed. I myself have always been a believer in the supernatural and things that go bump in the night. I remember once when I was riding with my father down one of the dirt roads that crisscrossed his vast ranch. We came around a curve and had to stop. About 8 feet away from us was a huge coyote standing there in the road. My father instantly grew very nervous, and his entire demeanor had changed. He said, "Son, look down at the floorboard now," grabs his pistol, aiming outside the window, taking a shot at it. I'm wondering, "Dad, why are you shooting at a coyote for?" He takes about 2 or 3 shots and lets hard on the gas. I pop my head back up. The next thing you know, this larger-than-life coyote is full-on chasing my dad's Jeep, and it's keeping up just fine. I look at it, and the first thing I notice about this thing is its face is different. It does not look like a regular coyote. It has the face much more like that of a man, complete with a very aggressive expression too. Its eyes were glowing a bright red, and it had a very human-like face and these incredibly large teeth hanging out of its mouth, much the same way a saber-toothed cat would look. I was terrified at such a young age, screaming at my father to drive faster, all the while begging for him to tell me what that was. I thought it was a coyote, etc. He didn't even answer me until we got back to the main road. He said that, my son, was a skinwalker, and he'd shoot it again if he ever saw one. They are very dangerous and can and will kill you. He told me the same one had been around the ranch for a long time now, and keeps coming back to hunt down his livestock. He's been meaning to try and kill it, but it keeps coming back, my father said. However, as scary as all this was, I wouldn't get my first real taste of terror until years later when I was much older. This was just an introductory, so I would know they are real. This is what changed my perspectives on those beings. So years pass. During my days as a high schooler, I'm now about 17 or 16. Me and my best friend, we'll call him Jason, a guy I'd hang out all the time with after school, decided to take a trip with me into town. We bought some beer and hard liquor. Jason was 22, so he was old enough to buy it, even though we hung out all the time. He never minded much when I drank. However, he was much more of a drinker than I ever was, so the alcohol was primarily for him. We leave for the store in one of the towns nearest to my father's ranch. I'm driving, and we're flying down the dirt road. We noticed something odd in the middle of an intersection. It looked like a bunch of deer and cattle skulls piled up into small cairns. There was one on both sides of the road. We slow down, investigate what we're looking at, and I'm getting a really bad feeling. Just being there. These look like they were recently put up. If you saw it, you would know what I'm talking about. They just looked wrong. We get a closer look, and I'm trying to figure out what it is when Jason interrupts and goes, "What on God's green earth is that thing?" He exclaims. And so I'm asking, "What are you talking about?" He's pointing at this large black dog-like creature on the other side of the road, looking at us like we're dinner. And the first thing I notice about it is that it has these incredibly bright, noticeable red eyes, much like the Skinwalker I saw years earlier. Almost like these eyes were on fire. I did not see any pupils. I noticed its face, very human-like with only a little bit of animalistic characteristics, down to the expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. This thing was pissed, and it was not afraid to let us know. Me and Jason were terrified, so we began to back up slowly, keeping our eyes on it. Now, it started to growl at us, and I know what this is. This isn't just a dog. This is a darn Skinwalker trying to scare us off. I grabbed the pistol from the glove compartment, shouted at Jason, getting in the truck. Now he jumps in the passenger side, and I floor the car. We make it out of there pretty fast. You can't really expect any less when you're being chased by a thing that looks like it came out of hell. We get back to my dad's ranch, and he had asked us what was up. We both just sat there and shaking, told him the story of what had happened. My dad looked at me seriously and explained that this was a Skinwalker, and they are very dangerous again, as if we had somehow forgot. He told me that the one I saw had been around the place for years, but never once has it tried to attack. The only reason it was now is because I shot at it, which I had forgotten about. He told me that if one of them ever gets aggressive with you, you shoot to kill. They are incredibly fast and have almost absurd amounts of stamina. I've been very careful now about where I go rendezvousing, even as an adult. Luckily, I've since moved long away from there. This was all back in the early 2000s. My old man has since passed. God bless his heart. I moved around 2008 and I got a job out of state. The life of the desert is behind me. I believe Jason moved to the East Coast, if I'm remembering right. He's staying with extended family. I live in California now, Northern Cali, where the big redwoods are. It's beautiful out here. Just a different kind of beauty. Anyhow, that's all for now. Take care, and thanks for all you do. These events have changed my life entirely. I will never, or have I ever been, the same since. I have never found my family since this day, and I realize that these beings are actually real. They are not to be trifled with, and the supernatural realm is dangerous. It's time that I finally sit down now after these years and write my story. My family deserves it. My family and I had just moved into a new house. My parents bought it as a foreclosure. This was on the outskirts of a small town in New Mexico. They wanted to turn it into a bed and breakfast, but they lacked the finances for it. So they turned to some of my other family who had some money, and they bought the house. Long story short, it was a bad idea to buy that place. Anywho, we just moved in and our first night was rather peaceful. We were all pretty tired. We decided to go to sleep early. Little did we know, that was not going to be the case. The following night, we were all getting ready to go to bed again, and I could hear my family in the bedroom. I could hear them talking about something but could not make out what it was, so I rolled over and tried to go to sleep. But I heard a loud scream. It sounded like it was coming from my parents' room. So I ran downstairs and made sure everything was okay. And I saw it. There's this tall, dark shape by the window just staring at my parents, who were just asleep on the bed. I froze up, standing there completely still. I couldn't look away, at least not for too long. It was tall and had a very human stature, but it wasn't human. It was all black and had these glowing orange eyes. It made you feel like death. My parents were asleep, and I realized all the commotion of conversation was this thing, mimicking their voices. The scream that I'd heard had come from outside by this thing. It quickly turned and noticed me in the door, looking at it, and I saw this scowl impression come across its face. It turned away from the window. I quickly ran away, went back upstairs, locked myself in the bedroom. I can't believe my parents were sleeping through all of this. As I get up to my room, I hear this thing or person trying to get into the house. It's wiggling the door handle, trying to open the windows. Now I'm in full-on panic mode. I pull out my phone and I start to dial 911. I hear my parents start screaming now. I'm assuming they've woken up and saw this thing. I call 911. I tell them exactly what is happening. They're asking me questions and I'm telling them I don't think it's a person. After playing 20 questions with the operator, they tell me, "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't help you. Good luck," and hang up on me. I couldn't believe it. Since when does 911 leave you high and dry? I didn't have time to think about that, though. I could hear my parents downstairs scrambling as this thing is trying to break in. And I hear something even more terrifying. The glass to the back window shatters and I hear a scream that sounded like a woman and a wolf howling together. It was awful, chilling me to the bone. I locked my bedroom door, made sure it was locked. I felt my heart was about to jump right out of my chest. I was so scared. I ran out to the bedroom window to see if I can spot anything. I see more figures approaching our house. They kind of slumped and dragged their feet, and surely but slowly, they approached closer and closer. I was seeing more of these same figures that were trying to get into my house now, approaching. From what I could tell, their movements reminded me of somebody who was very drunk, kind of staggering, but they appeared to be men covered in various animal pelts, and they were also very dark. Dark as in no light on their bodies, just black, and this black kind of smoky mist surrounding them. We were being invaded by something from hell. I was convinced. My parents were still screaming downstairs, and eventually, all the sound stopped. I sat up in my room, way too terrified to move a muscle, but could not understand for the life of me why all the sound had suddenly stopped. What the cause of this was. I tried to look out the window and didn't see anything anymore. I was too afraid to open my door, yell out down to give my position away. So I sat there and sat there. Eventually, I fell asleep and woke up with the sun shining in my face. I bolted out of the room and the house is a disaster. Everything is torn to shreds, broken. It's a mess. My parents are missing, and there's blood all over the ground, right by the shattered window. I panicked, called 911 again. I explained the whole ordeal to the operator and was told that people would be sent out to my house, but it might be a while. I explained that's too long and it could be too late for my parents, but the operator was very, very dismissive. I think they were thinking it was a prank. I didn't know what to do. I had nobody to call. I was alone in the house with whatever monster that had gotten to my parents, and now I was terrified. After half an hour, 2 squad cars pull up to my house. They get out and walk around and look at the damage around and inside. I talk to them and tell them what I think, and they think I did this. They look at me like I'm crazy, like I'm the one who was responsible. Why I would think something like that, like I'm some sort of threat. I try to explain, but they just won't listen. After a brief disagreement, but really it was a pretty heated verbal dispute, I was handcuffed and arrested for the disappearance of my family. I was put in the back of the squad car and questioned by detectives. I told them my story, which they mocked me for the most part, But after about 2 hours of me pleading my case, they decided to send somebody over to my house to look around. After another hour passes, these detectives leave and come back. Tell me my family is missing and I'm the prime suspect. My case of a monster did it isn't going to cut it. I pleaded and cried to these detectives. They wouldn't buy it. They said they were going to do a search for the house with cadaver dogs. At this point, I didn't know what else to do or say. I sat there in disbelief and cried. About 45 minutes later, the detectives now come back, and they found something by my house. They claim it was some sort of ward. It was a skull of a coyote. It had my name etched into it, burned, seared into the bone. They told me they had found it by the house where the shattered glass was, and if I knew anything about it. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't believe me. I was questioned for more hours, but I stuck with my story of not knowing what they were talking about. Finally, the detectives had enough and they left. I was alone again in the police station, awaiting any release. Suddenly, one of the detectives comes back with a piece of paper. He tells me that he wrote what I told him and gave me the paper to read it over again. When I went to see what he wrote, I couldn't believe what was on the paper. It said that I had claimed an extraterrestrial had taken my family, and in the last line, it read, "I'm pleading innocent." At that moment, I was terrified. The detective told me that both the men in the last few hours had gone back to my place of residency, only to see a strange being wearing all animal skins that tried to attack them and fellow officers. This being or person was shot at and vanished into the ground. The detective acknowledged that this was indeed something supernatural, apologizing to me, but said that he had no choice because of the evidence. He then told me that I would be set free and that I should take it easy. He didn't mention much more on what attacked them, but they tried to kill it. Apparently, it would not die. They shot it apparently 20 times and in the end, disappearing, leaving into a smoking crater. I don't know what to believe about what happened that day. I know what I saw. It was just an animal skin-wearing being. Looked just like the drawings of what you would call a skinwalker. I don't know what happened to my family, and why this thing took them. Could it have been the same being I saw? The one that took my family, or could this have been something else? Maybe extraterrestrial? I don't know. All I do is speculate that it is some sort of hallucination or something. If you're reading this, I would appreciate a full-on investigation. I know it's haunted with the supernatural entities of this world. I moved to rural New Mexico from San Francisco. I had spent a lot of time as a child in the woods and camping, so the first thing I did when I moved here was buying a tent and some camping equipment. I found somebody with some land and had trails for hiking, private property signs all around it. I went camping there several times on these trails, until one day, I noticed these very strange sets of footprints that did not look like anything I'd ever seen before in my life. I decided to follow them to see where they led, and when I came across the tracks again in a clearing, these were tracks of incredible size, canine specifically, larger than any I had seen before. I know there's coyotes out here, just like out in Southern California, but these were unlike any coyote tracks I'd ever seen. They were about 10 inches in length. I came across the tracks again, so I decided to follow them. They ended up and just stopped a short distance away, as if whatever had made them just stopped in one spot and vanished. It was bizarre. I ignored it though, and went on with my evening. I went back and made my campsite, went on with my day, and the following night, I was awakened to a low growling sound. It was coming from right outside the tent. So I very slowly unzipped my tent, shining a light out, and could not see anything. I went back inside and zipped the tent up again. As I'm laying there, I hear what sounds like whispering. I call out, "Who's there?" But then the whispering suddenly stops. Now I'm starting to worry there's some psycho out there who's going to murder me. Just then, a voice calls out my name. Now, immediately, I can tell you some things wrong with this scenario playing out. The voice calling out my name was that of my late grandfather, whom I grew up very close with. He had died when I was 14. He's been dead for years at this point. I was with him when he died on his deathbed. We said our goodbyes. It was his voice I heard call my name. A name and a voice I hadn't heard for a long time. It sounded like somebody, though, was trying to imitate his voice and not his natural voice. I don't know how to describe it. I've never felt fear like that wash over my entire being before. I felt so helpless and weak. I couldn't call out for help because it almost felt as if I was being held down by a force. I managed to muster the strength to call out again. "My name is Kyle. Who's there? Why do you keep calling my name?" But the voice did not answer back. The night was silent. You could just faintly hear the wind. I didn't like this one bit. Thankfully, I carried my trusty .308. I reached for my revolver, which I kept in a knapsack right next to my sleeping bag, figuring it was go time. Then, someone here is messing with me, wanting to cause me harm. I was not about any of it, and I was going to put a stop to all this madness here in just a second when I pulled out my trusty boomstick, as I like to call it. I grabbed my revolver out of its holster and pulled to safety, unzipped my tent quickly, rapidly pointing my revolver in every which way. The campfire was still barely going, just burning ember coals at this point. I felt so on edge that even a pencil head dropping in the distance, I would have been firing this thing. I stood up outside my tent, looking around nervously, yelling out, "You want me? Come and get me. Whoever you are, here I am. Hey, what's wrong? Scared now that I have a weapon?" Even in my brief moments of bravery, I still felt that this revolver was all that stood between me and whatever was out there in the desert darkness. Just beyond that darkness was someone or something. I could feel it. I felt like my entire being was screaming for a fight. It was going to go down. I just knew it. I could feel it. Any moment now, this thing or person was going to step out of the shadows and reveal themselves. No one did. I wasn't brave enough to step outside the light, at least not that confident. But I'm looking around, trying to taunt whatever this thing is, and I could just feel eyes being drilled into me. I was most definitely being watched beyond the line of light, and I knew it meant ill of me. After saying some more choice words to this person or thing, I climbed back in my tent and waited patiently. I did not even bother to get in my sleeping bag at this point. I just crouched down right there in my tent, waiting, and waiting, and waiting. Soon enough, I hear this thing right outside my tent again, and it sounded like somebody was out there. Call me crazy because of what I did here, but I just turned my revolver towards where I heard the noise, firing one shot through the tent. As soon as I did this, the most inhuman, demonic, screaming roar I've ever heard amidst through the night, like a pierce. I thought it was just about to burst my eardrums, it was so loud. I hear it, and it takes off at the speed of light down into the valley below to the desert of the night, screaming in the distance. My only thought after this was, I have to leave here now. Things are no longer safe. I packed as much as I could, literally running out of there. Just about everything behind me in my wake. I refused to sit around any longer while I waited for this thing to come back with its buddies, or potentially even worse. I'm not ashamed of myself at all for what I did. I did what I had to do. The thing had no business being near me. It sounded like the scream of a banshee let loose in the world to haunt us all. I'm not sure if it was an animal or something more paranormal, but whatever it was, it had every intention of doing harm to me, and I was waiting. It planned on coming for me at night. I knew I was out there in this place, and it found me. I don't know what it was, but I do know that it wanted to hurt me. It felt like this thing was responsible for all the weirdness out in that area. I just wanted to not be in its presence anymore. So, as far as being since then, I haven't camped out in the desert since. I believe that based off my story, I ran into what they're calling a Skinwalker, or a Navajo witch, referred to by some. I don't care what it is. I just wanted it dead. In fact, I don't even remember the movie quote, but it was something along the lines of, if it bleeds, it can be killed. Hope you enjoyed my story. Have a blessed day. I was 21, about to turn 22 in a few months. I was driving home from work at night. Now, I don't know if this is the reason why it happened, but I was driving home from work at about 11:30 p.m. Work had been a very long day, and I just wanted to go to sleep. I was driving on a 2-lane highway that had forest on both sides. I was in the left lane, and there were no other vehicles around me. The forest right next to the highway was pitch black. You couldn't really see anything because there were no lights. It was really spooky. I noticed coming around a bend in the road, and I do mean a sharp turn, that the woods seemed to open up, and there was this weird, ominous glowing coming from deep within the forest. It didn't look like a light from a house or anything, come to think of it. It was very surreal. I kind of felt sick to my stomach when I saw it. The glow was pulsating, and the longer I looked at it, the worse my stomach felt. I remember thinking to myself that there must be a fire. That's the only reason I could think of for it to look that way. My car began slowing down on its own. I felt paralyzed. I could not move my arm or legs. I was just stuck there staring at this glow coming from deep within the forest. And this thing slowly began to walk out of the woods. What I was seeing looked like a large man in dark robes with a deer skull headdress. That was enough for me. I tried to floor it, but my car had completely died and was now coming to a complete stop. I was about 5 miles from home. I turned my head and just stared out the window to my left. I don't know why, but I didn't look behind me or to the right. There were no other cars on the road, as I said. And there this thing stood, looking at me. I've never felt fear like this. It was on a primal level. It shoots through your entire being. I felt paralyzed. I forced myself to look away, but it wasn't any use. This creature was doing something to me. I could not move. I looked back to see it move closer, and now it's right in front of my car. I don't remember how, but it was. This being started psychologically communicating with me, putting thoughts in my mind and speaking to me. Thoughts of death, killing, sacrifice. It was mental torment. It raised its hand as the same way a puppeteer raised their hand controlling a puppet. And I realized right away, its hand was a skeletal hand. No flesh or nothing, just pure bone. I immediately vomited all over myself. I lost all muscle control over my body, and my heart began beating erratically, like I was having heart murmurs or something. And I felt like I was dying. That's the only way to describe the feeling. Then, it slowly began to walk towards my driver's side door. The entire time, it was speaking into my mind about death and sacrifice. I was to be killed. As it neared my driver's side door, my door, which was locked, suddenly became unlocked. This is the part of my mind that just kind of blurred out. The being, whoever what it was, had ripped me from the vehicle. I had lost consciousness at one point, everything turning black. The next part is hard to talk about it, but I'll do my best. I awoke in the hospital about 4 days later. I was missing my left hand and had severe burns all over my body, and these strange demonic markings burned into my flesh. When I asked doctors, who were surprised to see me even conscious, they found me stripped naked, burned, beaten, and brutalized on the side of the road. They thought I was dead, but I still had a slight pulse. Even though my left hand was removed, the wound had been cauterized. I have no idea how to explain what had happened to me. And my memory of this being only was till later. Even my car was now gone. I'm sorry. I'll have to continue the rest of the details in a further email. This is too traumatic for me to talk about. I'm sorry. A couple of months ago, I was camping in the wooded area of my town. It was right around 10:45, and everybody else had gone to sleep in their tents. I was the only one awake, and decided to go for a walk, so I would not fall asleep. I walked about maybe a quarter mile into the woods, and there was this really bad smell. It was like foul, rotting meat mixed with garbage. I looked around to see if there was any animal nearby, but didn't see anything. I just attributed it to a dead animal and kept walking. Well, 5 minutes of walking, and now I was on top of a small hill, and I could see something strange in the distance, down below. What I saw was horrifying, but to say it was a monster might be a bit of an outcry. I definitely think it was some sort of identifiable animal. It was roughly 20 to 30 yards away, but I could feel its presence immediately as soon as I saw it. All the hair on my arms stood up and I froze. Everything was silent, and the only thing moving beside me were its eyes. I remember them very vividly. These two green orbs glowing on this dark figure. Any other features were hard to see other than its outline, but I could feel something different about its stare, like it was glaring into my actual soul. I could not move and honestly did not even want to breathe. After some time had passed, it let out this growl, turned around and went up a hill. Once it was gone, I sprinted out of the woods and did not stop until I was back in my tent. I told everybody what had happened, and I have yet to go camping in the woods again. I will never forget what I saw until I know what it was. I refuse to go back. I know this is my first post, but I'm tired of keeping it inside. This really creeps me out, and I've been too embarrassed to tell anybody. So, I grew up in a tiny town of about 1,000 people. There were lots of open fields around it. It was very secluded. I will call the town Town X. I'm now 23. This occurred when I was about 12 or 13. My parents went out of town on some business for a couple of days. I stayed with my aunt and uncle because they lived just around the corner. Now, at this point, I had a pretty bad skin condition. It would cause my skin to itch and burn all the time. It came with a fever sometimes, and it was just really uncomfortable. But there wasn't much I could do about it. So my dermatologist was pretty much useless, in my opinion. She prescribed me some really powerful steroids, which I was supposed to apply twice a day. It didn't do much. Anyway, my aunt and uncle were pretty understanding of my condition, but they were also pretty old school. They didn't really believe in taking too many pills or seeing the doctor for every little reason. So I was forced to pretty much stick out with this uncomfortable skin condition. I had to learn how to get through it without too many drugs or trips to the doctor. My uncle had a cap on how often he would take me. He would always say, rubbing that stuff on your skin was bad. The only thing that kind of relieved my skin was taking a really hot bath and scrubbing really hard with a loofah, but I can only do that with about once a week without my skin breaking out. Anyway, it was about 11 at night. I couldn't sleep. My skin was being a total Nazi. It was too early to take a bath, so I was just there laying in bed, trying my best not to scratch or rub my skin against anything. I just had a t-shirt on and some shorts. Well, after about an hour of being completely restless, I decided to get up and go to the kitchen for a glass of water. I usually went through a big jug of water every couple of days, so it was usually always fully stocked. My uncle was also a pack-a-day kind of smoker, but I didn't think too much of it. He had smoked for like 40 years, so I assumed it was normal that the house smelled like an ashtray. Anyway, as soon as I entered the kitchen, I noticed that there was this weird smell in the air. It was like dirt and garbage, and something else. Something I could not quite put my finger on. It was like this musky, rotten smell that was just overly nauseating. I would say it kind of smelled like an old wet dog, but there was more of a pungent stench to it. Like, if the smell of the wet dog was rotting, then this would be that. So, I grabbed a glass from the cupboard, turning on the faucet. I turned the water on and I noticed that it smells like the horrible stench in the air even worse. So I'm thinking, oh no, it's in the water. It smells like something died. Like I said, water comes from an old well in the backyard. It's been there since before I was born. I thought maybe the pipes got clogged or something. I didn't know what to do. but I knew that if my uncle was here, he would have told me to call a plumber. So I did the only thing I could think of, and that was to get back to my bed and try not to breathe the air, which sucked. The smell was so strong in there. I could tell that it didn't come from my room. It definitely did not smell like that in there. After about 20 minutes, I could still smell the awful stench outside my room. It was killing me. I had to go do something about it. I could not go in the living room because my aunt and uncle were asleep, so I had no choice but to get out of bed and go outside. Once I got on my shoes, I went out the back door into the yard. It was a full moon, so there was enough illumination. I looked around the area where the smell was coming from and noticed that it seemed to be the strongest around my uncle's old shed. I went over to it, tried to opening the door. It was locked. I had to find the key in order to open it. I fumbled around in some nearby rocks and found the key. This is where my uncle usually kept stuff. I put it in the keyhole and turned it. To my surprise, the door opened. I did not understand why it would be locked when nobody was using it. As soon as I opened the door, I was hit with an even worse smell. It actually made me gag a little bit. But what I saw inside the shed was even worse. Animal carcasses were littered in here. Not only did it reek like death, but the smell of wet dog and urine were so strong, it was nearly vomit-inducing. I had to shut the door. The smell of the stench was horrific. I stood outside the shed for a little while thinking about what to do. I knew that I had to do something, but what? I wasn't thinking straight. The smell was so strong. I had actually vomited quite a few times. I knew that if it smelled that bad outside the shed, there was no doubt in my mind that there's something even worse inside. I could hear something big coming in my direction toward the shed. This was coming from behind. I ran to my room as fast as I could. I knew that whatever it was had to have been the animal bedding down in here. So, after this, I stayed in my room the rest of the night. The smell eventually dissipating, but it took a while. I was not able to get any sleep, so I stayed in there the whole night. And in the morning, when I woke up, my uncle was already at work. My aunt asked me why I did not come out to eat breakfast or why I was so pale. I told her that I was not feeling well. She believed me. My uncle came home from work later that day. I told him about what had happened. He got really weirded out by it and kept asking me a bunch of questions, and I could tell he didn't believe me. He always tells me that I have an overactive imagination, so when I try to talk to him about some of the strangest things I've seen and heard, he doesn't believe me, or at least that's what it seems like. But this time, I know what I saw was real. That thing, whatever it was, smelled like some kind of animal with horrid rotting flesh. I know it sounds crazy, but maybe my mind is finally going, and the fact that my aunt and uncle don't believe me is just making matters worse. I've also been getting a lot of migraines lately. I can't help but wonder if something is going to happen. I want to tell people about what happened, but something is stopping me. Maybe I'm just afraid that they won't believe me either. I know what I saw, and it's kept me up at night ever since. There are so many times I want to talk about it, but I can't. And now my mom and dad think that I've been trying to get attention again because of what happened. I'm writing this down instead. Maybe somebody will believe me. Something was living in my uncle's shed, and now it's going to come back for me. I can't sleep anymore. I'm afraid of what will happen when I do. I think it's trying to get to me, but why? What did I ever do? I was visiting my folks in Utah over the New Year's weekend. We were doing some general outdoor activity. On one of those days, I went walking around some rock formations. This was right around Lake Powell. After about an hour or two of hiking, I decided that I had seen enough and began working my way back towards civilization. However, something caught my attention. There was a small cave entrance with what appeared to be a man-sized hole next to it. Curiosity got the better of me, so I approached. Upon closer inspection, it became apparent that someone had manufactured this hole. There were clear chisel marks all along the edges, and I was able to peer in it and see that it had opened up into a larger chamber just past the entrance. I couldn't help but think that there might be maybe gold or some kind of treasure in these caverns. so I tried to get my father's attention. We both decided against going down here, figuring it probably was not a good idea. But the cave looked pretty doable. After closer inspection and making our way back down into it, we can see that this apparently wasn't an ordinary cave. There was graffiti and other stuff in here, and it seemed dirtier than usual. So we figured we'd only be here for a couple of minutes, and we tried to spin it crawling around. Maybe we can find something, even if it wasn't much. We started seeing some interesting things written all over. Pentagrams and weird-looking sigil-like symbols. It turns out, we weren't the only ones to notice these symbols. As we're looking, we're hearing sounds coming deeper off into the caverns. These strange yelling and guttural roars, followed by bestial snarls. My dad and I did not stick around to ask any questions. We took off at a sprint. I'm not exactly sure what those were, but maybe we had encountered skinwalkers. Although I know very little about the whole phenomenon, but it does make me wonder. So, this summer, 2021, I was visiting my cousin in Wyoming. He lives pretty deep in the woods, so it's really secluded, and there's really only a few houses in the entire neighborhood. I stayed with him for about 3 days before something really weird happened. My cousin is a pretty laid-back, easygoing guy. Not much bothers him. He's not that into horror or anything like that. He enjoys comedies and stuff of not the scary nature. So we're just sitting there in a shed, smoking a bowl, waiting for his buddies to show up. It's around 8 p.m. It was pitch black outside and really quiet. A quick note. Right outside of his shed, he kind of has a small porch. And then his house, which is maybe 30 feet away, also has a small porch. And we're just sitting there talking, smoking weed, and it starts to get really, really quiet. That's when we began hearing these strange noises coming from the trees that surrounded us. The one thing that struck me as odd was how quickly they were getting closer. As soon as we had heard the first noise, it seemed to be immediately followed up by a bunch more. The noises were bizarre and unique to my cousin and I both. They didn't really sound like a typical animal, or a Bigfoot, I'm going to kill you kind of noise that you would expect to hear in a horror movie, or if you were being hunted by some monster. They were more like huffing noises. I don't really know how to describe it. It was super creepy, and we were hearing multiple sounds, so we assumed something bad was about to go down. We sat there in the dark, not knowing what to expect, so we just kept making jokes, trying to ease the situation. My cousin was telling me that he had seen a black figure running across the street earlier in that day, but we both brushed it off. We were pretty skeptical about the whole thing. Then, I swear to God, the noises stopped. We looked at each other like, what do we do now? And then, about 3 seconds later, the noises started again, except this time it was coming from the direction of my cousin's house. At that point, we were just confused and we didn't know what to think. Then, something in the woods began howling, and we knew something big was there. We're both pretty scared at this point, watching the trees in the direction of his house, waiting for something to happen. We're looking at each other like, what is going on? Then, it got quiet again. I could see the trees start to violently shake, and it felt like something was charging through them. The noises were really getting loud, and I could tell whatever this thing was, it was going to start soon emerging through the trees to be revealing itself. Maybe now is a good time. We should go inside, I told my cousin. Yeah, I think you're right, he responded. So we start packing up our stuff. But before we can grab it all, this black figure begins emerging from the tree line. It's big. I could not see its face or anything, but I could tell it was large. Like taller than me, but I'm about 6'1", so that's a pretty safe bet to assume it was more than human height. We began running into the house, shut and locked the door behind us, pushing up some furniture in front of it. Now, my cousin is packing up some weapons he keeps in the back for this sort of occasion. He pulls out his double-barreled shotgun and walks into the living room. That's when I noticed that one of his dogs are gone, which he keeps in the backyard. I'm going to see where my dog went, I told him. He just looks at me and brings his finger to his lips and motions for me to be quiet. He puts his ear against the door to listen for any activity. I went into his kitchen, looked out the window to see if any dogs were visible anywhere. The woods were now silent. It seemed like nothing was moving or even breathing at this point. Then, I saw something black darting across the yard, going behind a tree, where we all heard the strange noises coming from earlier. "You can't go out there with that thing, are you crazy?" my cousin told me. Well, at this point, I'm more afraid of whatever it is out there than your dog. So he says, "All right, but stay behind the tree line." So I walk over there and make my way around to where his dog had gone. As soon as I get close enough to the area where the black figure disappeared earlier, it comes darting out of the trees, heading straight towards me. It was breathing really hard, making these weird huffing noises at this point. I don't know what to do, so I'm standing there frozen, and it gets closer and closer, and stops about 10 feet away from me. This thing was massive, black all over. The face was even dark and just these large, sharp teeth jutting out of its mouth. I couldn't move at this point. My legs were shaking underneath me, but I couldn't run either way. This thing was blocking my direction. I couldn't escape if I wanted to. This thing let out this slow hiss at me. I think if it wanted to have taken me, it could have very easily. But it didn't. It's like whatever this being was just wanted to instill fear in me, to intimidate me, as if to let me know, hey, I'm on top of the food chain, and you're not. Its yellow eyes are forever burned into my very soul. I heard my cousin's dog barking off in the woods about 50 feet in. This thing quickly turned its head in response to the barking, looked back at me, then looked back at the direction of the barking, and quickly disappeared towards that direction. I was convinced this thing was going to kill his dog, so I run back to the house and let my cousin know. Your dog got out, and this thing is going to kill it. Now, my cousin is so panicked and scared, he just starts crying. What are we going to do? Suddenly, I see my cousin's dog come running out of the woods, yelping and crying. His leg was bent backwards. He was limping bad and cut up pretty badly, and bleeding. We'd had to go and take him to the vet immediately to get taken care of. We just grabbed him, got up in the car and left with him. We had to explain to the vet that we believe he got into a fight with a cougar, but the vet could not understand the deep slashes, cuts, gashes, and how its leg was ultimately broken backwards. Well, there's not much else worth writing down for the story. That's the premise of it. His dog came out okay, but there's something evil and messed up back in those woods since then. We don't even go out onto the porch anymore. We're way too scared.